Greetings all you movie junkies and entertainment lovers, and welcome to another top 10 video. Previously we counted down my top 10 all-time favorite slasher movies, and today we're going to be counting down my top 10 most underrated slasher movies. These are all movies that I think are either overlooked or don't deserve the hate that they get. Now before we continue, as I always point out with my other lists, it's important to remember this is just my personal list of top 10 most underrated slasher movies. Number 10, we have Jason X, the 10th installment of the Friday the 13th franchise, and one of the most divided of the entire series as well. It's a movie that's best enjoyed when not taken too seriously, because, well, it really isn't trying to be a Friday the 13th movie at all. The best way to describe this movie is as an over-the-top science fiction monster movie, where the monster in this case happens to be Jason Voorhees. So if that sounds like a good time to you, then chances are you'll enjoy it. It's certainly not a great film, but it's one that I personally have a lot of fun with and don't think it deserves the hate it gets. At number 9, we have Child's Play 3. Perhaps the most divided of the Chucky franchise, although certainly not the strongest entry, it's also far from being the worst entry as well. There's really nothing about it to me personally that stands out as being very problematic, other than the fact that it suffers from repeating much of the same storyline of the first two films and perhaps not treading enough new ground. But to me, it's still a much more entertaining sequel than most of the recent entries in the franchise. Number 8, we have Leatherface, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre 3. It's a film that definitely feels inferior to the wild carnage craziness of the previous film, and of course the iconic original. But despite much of the film being censored due to the MPAA's unfounded grudge against horror movies at the time, and not fully living up to the previous two entries, this film to me still manages to stand on its own as an enjoyable slasher movie that's more inspired by the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, rather than being something that fully lives up to it. At number 7, we have Friday the 13th Part 7, The New Blood. Pretty notable in that it was the first film in the franchise to feature Kane Hodder as Jason, but despite that, it's actually not one of the more beloved films of the franchise. Much like Texas Chainsaw 3, this film was hacked up by the MPAA at the time, and there was a lot of blood and gore that was cut from the final film. Now for me personally, it's not that big of an issue because I don't go into these movies looking for tons of blood and gore, so it's more of a secondary issue to me than it is with others. But despite its censorship problems, it still manages to be a pretty fun movie, with the ending being an awesome practical effects extravaganza that's enough for me to make it worth a watch. At number 6, we have Slaughterhouse. This is a bit of a lesser known film that very much is in the same vein of the original Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and honestly I would say of all the movies I've seen over the years that attempt to replicate the same tone, look and feel of the original Texas Chainsaw, I would say this is the one that to me at least gets the closest. Now of course it's nowhere near as infamous as the original Texas Chainsaw, or probably ever will be, but its unique style and vibe are definitely enough to make this one worth a look. Number 5, we have Fall Break, also known as The Mutilator. Another lesser known 80s slasher, this one has its own unique vibe. Instead of the stereotypical cabin in the woods setting like so many of these other films have, this one switches it for a condo on the beach setting, and does a really solid job at balancing different tones, being both very lighthearted, whilst also having a more sinister edge to it as well. It may be a little slow in parts, but it's enjoyable enough to make it worth a watch. Number 4, we have Urban Legend. A film that very much came in the wake of the massive success of Scream, which totally revitalized the slasher genre as a whole, with Urban Legend being one of the prime examples of the many films that followed, playing with the knowledge of various urban legends in a very similar way that Scream played with horror movie tropes. Despite the fact that this one may take a lot of inspiration and format from Scream, it very much has enough of its own originality and highlight moments to make it worth a watch. And at number 3, we have Psycho 4: The Beginning. The original Psycho is often considered to be responsible for creating the whole slasher subgenre to begin with, But despite that fact, it's really not considered to be a slasher movie itself. But by the time you get to the sequels, the slasher craze was in full effect, with Psycho 3 absolutely crossing the line, being made as a straight up slasher film. So even though Psycho 4 is not really a straight slasher film in my mind, I still decided to include it on this list simply because it's just a really underrated horror movie in general. Is made as a partial sequel slash prequel to the original Psycho. And thanks to the most recent 4K restoration of the film, you would never know that this was done as a made-for-TV movie originally, which is part of the reason why I believe it has been overlooked for many years. Number 2, we have The Burning. Released in 1981, The Burning at the time was largely seen and dismissed as a shameless cash grab on the success of the first two Friday the 13th films, even though it was conceptualized before the first film even came out. But over the years, the film has been able to gain a cult following, with many preferring it to the original Friday the 13th. It is a legitimately well-made slasher that, despite having many similarities to Friday the 13th, definitely has enough of its own elements to not be dismissed as a ripoff in any way. And then at number 1, we have Dark Night of the Scarecrow. A film I very much could have easily had on my list of all-time favorite slasher movies, but I decided to save it for this list instead. It's another film that I don't think of really as a slasher in my mind, but rather as just a really well-made horror movie that's far better than it has any right to be, especially for a made-for-TV movie from 1981. And like many slashers, it very much plays out like a mystery as to whom or what is responsible for all the killings. It's a very simple concept and story that's told to perfection and remains as a very overlooked and underappreciated horror movie in general. Well, there you go guys, that was my top 10 most underrated slasher movies. Feel free to jump in the comments down below and let me know what your top 10 most underrated slasher movies would be. So until next time, be sure to consume as much entertainment as humanly possible, and I will see you in the next video.